3,000 soldiers entered the valley before sunrise. Only 3 walked out. No artillery barrage announced the attack. No heroic charge followed. No warning flares rose into the sky. The trap was already set. Maps said the route was safe. Intelligence said the enemy had withdrawn. Command said it would be a routine advance. Secure the pass, move forward, and be gone by nightfall. What the maps didn't show was patience. What intelligence didn't detect was silence. What command underestimated was how deadly stillness could be. By the time the first body hit the ground, the valley had already decided the outcome. This is not a story about bravery under fire. It is a story about how war kills quietly. This is Dark War Records. The valley didn't have a name on most maps. Just a contour line squeezed between 2 ridges, drawn narrow enough to suggest caution but not danger. A natural corridor, the kind armies had used for centuries to move men and machines quickly. That was exactly why it was chosen. The column stretched for miles, infantry at the front, support units in the middle, artillery and supply trucks following behind. The morning fog hung low, thick enough to soften outlines but thin enough to move through. Too quiet. Boots crushed gravel, metal clinked. Low voices murmured orders. Everything sounded normal, yet something felt wrong in a way no briefing could explain. No birds, no wind, no distant gunfire. War zones were never silent. Silence meant someone was waiting. The lead scouts reached the narrowest point just after dawn. Rock walls rose sharply on both sides, cutting off sight lines and swallowing sound. The valley floor tightened, forcing the column closer together. Perfect terrain. Still, nothing happened. Minutes passed. Then came the first sound. Not an explosion. Not gunfire. A single metallic snap. One soldier collapsed forward without a scream. His helmet rolled into the dirt. The man behind him bent down instinctively, and fell too, blood misting the air in a soundless spray. Then the valley woke up. Machine guns erupted from both ridges at once. Not scattered fire. Not panic shooting. Measured. Overlapping. Controlled. The first burst carved into the front ranks. The second stitched through the center of the column. The third tore into the rear, sealing the exit. Within seconds, the entire force was trapped inside a stone corridor of death. Men dove for cover that didn't exist. Trucks jackknifed into each other. Horses screamed. Radios crackled uselessly before going dead. The enemy never shouted, never charged, never revealed themselves. They didn't need to. From above, firing ports had been carved directly into the rock, camouflaged with netting and stone dust. Heavy weapons mounted weeks earlier, sighted perfectly down the valley floor. Every firing lane pre-measured, every angle rehearsed. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Those who tried to climb the ridges were cut down instantly. Those who stayed low were shredded by crossfire. Medics crawled toward the wounded and died beside them. The air filled with dust, blood, and fragments of men. And through it all, no enemy movement, just guns. Hours passed like this. Not constant firing. Controlled bursts. Enough to keep fear alive. Enough to force men to stay pinned. Enough to drain ammunition and hope at the same time. By mid-morning, officers realized the truth too late. There was no breakout. There was no relief force. The valley had been chosen precisely because help couldn't reach them. Artillery support was impossible. The ridges were too close. Air support was useless. The fog never lifted enough to identify targets, and any bomb dropped risked killing the trapped survivors instead. So command made the decision no one ever wanted written down. They stopped trying to save them. By afternoon, resistance collapsed into small pockets of survivors huddled behind wrecked vehicles and bodies stacked thick enough to stop bullets. Water ran out first. Then ammunition. Then courage. Men stopped firing back, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't see what they were fighting. Every attempt to signal surrender was ignored. The guns didn't care. As the sun lowered, the firing slowed. Not because mercy arrived, because the work was almost finished. The enemy waited until nightfall before moving. When they did, they came down the ridges quietly, methodically. No cheers, no celebrations. Just boots on stone and bayonets glinting faintly in dying light. Those still alive understood immediately. This trap had never been about territory. It was about annihilation. By dawn, the valley was silent again. 3,000 casualties lay scattered across less than a mile of earth. Bodies piled so thick in places that the ground couldn't be seen beneath them. Only 3 soldiers, wounded, dehydrated, and half delirious, had survived by playing dead beneath corpses for more than 20 hours. They didn't speak for days after rescue. When they finally did, they all said the same thing. It wasn't the guns that broke us. It was realizing the valley never planned to let us leave. What happened there was never officially named a massacre. It was recorded as heavy losses during engagement. Clean words, safe words, But every officer who studied that report afterward understood something that changed how wars were planned forever. The deadliest traps don't explode. They wait, and once they close, there is no heroism loud enough to escape them. The valley had been empty for weeks. At least, that's what reconnaissance photos showed. No tents, no fires, no vehicle tracks. Which was exactly the point. The trap wasn't built overnight. It wasn't even built for this specific column at first. It was part of a larger design, one that treated terrain like a weapon and time like ammunition. Local civilians had been cleared quietly months earlier. Anyone who asked questions vanished. Anyone who lingered was forced out. The valley became dead space. No movement, no noise, no life. Engineers arrived next, not with bulldozers or obvious equipment, but with hand tools, picks, chisels, drills powered by generators buried deep inside the ridges. They worked only at night, covered rock dust with soil, camouflaged every cut with natural stone. They carved firing galleries into the cliffs, long enough to hide heavy machine guns, mortars, and ammunition stores. Every position had overlapping coverage. Every blind spot was calculated and erased. They didn't need many men. They needed patience. Markers were placed along the valley floor, small stones, barely noticeable, used to measure distance. Gunners memorized ranges the way priests memorized prayers. If an enemy vehicle stopped here, it would be hit from 3 angles. If troops clustered there, mortars would rain down for exactly 30 seconds. If someone tried to retreat, those guns were already sighted. Weeks passed. Then months. And then the column came. By the time the first soldiers stepped into the killing zone, the trap had already existed longer than most of the men would remain alive. The enemy commander didn't even watch from the ridge. He listened. He listened to the rhythm of boots echoing through stone, to engines idling in confined space, to radios crackling inside a valley that swallowed signals. He waited for density. That was the key. A trap this precise needed the maximum number of men inside before it closed. Fire too early, and survivors scatter. Fire too late, and someone escapes. So they waited until the valley was full. The opening shot wasn't meant to kill many. It was meant to paralyze. That first sniper round hit an officer, not the highest rank, but the one giving directions at the front. Confusion rippled backward instantly. Orders stalled. Vehicles slowed. That hesitation was all they needed. When the machine guns opened, they fired low first, legs, not chests. Men fell forward, blocking movement. Panic compressed the column even tighter. Then they raised the aim. Mortars followed, timed not for destruction but disorientation. Explosions echoed violently between the rock walls, magnifying sound and shock. Men couldn't tell where rounds were coming from. They fired blindly. They screamed into radios that couldn't answer. Every natural instinct betrayed them. Take cover? There was none. Advance? Fire sealed the front. Retreat? The rear was already dying. Even the wounded became obstacles. Screaming men trapped others behind them. Corpses piled in places so densely that vehicles couldn't move forward or backward. Some officers tried to organize a counterattack. They stood up to signal, to shout orders, and were erased in seconds. Anyone who showed leadership died first. The trap had been designed to kill command before courage. By midday, the psychological collapse began. Not everyone was wounded. Not everyone was dead. But almost everyone was broken. Men cried openly. Others laughed uncontrollably. Some fired their weapons until barrels glowed red, then threw rifles aside and pressed faces into the dirt, begging the ground to hide them. The valley absorbed everything. Sound. Blood. Hope. Above them, the enemy conserved ammunition. They fired only when needed. They watched men bleed out slowly, knowing movement would start again eventually. Someone always tried. By late afternoon, resistance was no longer organized. It was individual. A soldier crawling toward a rock that offered no protection. A medic shielding a wounded man with his own body. A radio operator trying desperately to fix a wire while rounds chewed the ground around him. None of it mattered. When night fell, the valley didn't grow quieter. It grew closer. The enemy descended only when it was safe. When most weapons below had gone silent. When screams had thinned into whimpers. They moved with knives, pistols, and flashlights covered in cloth. No mercy, no witnesses. Except 3. Those 3 survived not because they fought, but because they disappeared. Beneath bodies, beneath blood, beneath the weight of men who would never stand again. They learned something terrible in those hours. That the trap didn't end with the gunfire. The trap ended only when no one was left to remember it. And somewhere beyond the valley, commanders were already preparing their next advance, unaware that the enemy had perfected a method that would be repeated again, and again, and again. Because once an army learns how to erase thousands quietly, noise becomes unnecessary. Would you like me to analyze the historical military tactics that inspire stories like this, or perhaps explore a different scenario involving this setting? By nightfall, the valley smelled different, not like gunpowder anymore. Not like smoke. It smelled like iron, wet earth, and something sour that no one ever forgot once they recognized it. Blood, soaked into stone. The firing had mostly stopped, not because the enemy had run out of targets, but because movement itself had nearly ended. The men still alive were no longer soldiers in formation. They were shapes pressed into shadows, listening to every sound with terror sharpened by exhaustion. Some whispered prayers. Some called out names that would never answer. Some lay still, hoping stillness might pass for death. That was when the survivors realized the truth. The valley wasn't just a killing zone. It was a collection point. Those firing galleries carved into the rock weren't temporary. They had storage rooms behind them, food, water, ammunition enough for days. This wasn't an ambush meant to disrupt. It was designed to consume. One wounded officer, bleeding from the thigh, fading in and out, managed to crawl beneath a burned-out truck. From there, he saw something that broke him more completely than the gunfire ever had. Figures moving along the ridgeline. Not rushing, not hiding, counting. They were counting bodies. Flashlights flicked on briefly, then off. Notes were taken. Hands pointed toward clusters of the dead, as if checking work against a list. The officer understood then. They had expected this number. 3,000 wasn't an accident. It was the goal. Every formation that entered the valley had been studied in advance. Strength estimates. Supply counts. March spacing. This trap wasn't improvised. It had been tuned like a machine. Somewhere far from the valley, staff officers would later argue over blame, over intelligence failures, over miscommunication. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Because the men dying there were not dying as part of a battle. They were dying as part of a calculation. As night deepened, the sounds changed. Boots on stone, metal scraping softly, short, sharp whispers in a language few below understood. The enemy had begun descending. Those who still clutched weapons fired wildly into darkness, hoping noise might scare someone away. It didn't. Muzzle flashes simply revealed positions. Shots answered immediately. Close. Precise. Final. In some places, knives were used instead of bullets, not for cruelty but efficiency. Ammunition was saved. Silence was preserved. A soldier who had survived the machine gun fire was found hiding between two corpses, breath shallow, eyes wide. When light hit his face, he raised his hands instinctively. The man above him hesitated for half a second, then struck. Elsewhere, a group of 5 wounded men tried to crawl together, believing numbers might protect them. They were found minutes later. Only one lived long enough to scream. The valley echoed once, then went quiet again. The 3 who would survive were spread far apart. None knew the others were alive. Each had been pinned under bodies heavy enough to crush breath from lungs, forced to inhale through blood-soaked fabric and dirt. They learned to control their breathing by pressing tongues against teeth. They learned not to blink when light passed inches from their eyes. They learned that the human body could stay still far longer than fear believed possible. One of them felt a boot rest briefly on his back. Not stomp, not crush, just test. When it lifted, he did not move for hours. Dawn came slowly, pale and indifferent. When the enemy finally withdrew, they did so methodically, destroying weapons, collecting identifiable gear, erasing signs of their presence. By mid-morning, the ridges were empty again. The valley returned to silence. Later, when friendly forces finally entered the area, days too late, the scene stunned even seasoned veterans. Bodies lay where they fell. No defensive perimeter, no organized last stand. Just chaos frozen in place. The official reports struggled to describe it. Overwhelming enemy fire, severe tactical disadvantage, unexpected resistance. No word captured what really happened, because there was no resistance to describe, only entrapment. The 3 survivors were evacuated separately, debriefed separately, and eventually silenced separately. Their accounts matched too closely to ignore. They all described the same realization, that the worst moment wasn't when the guns opened. It was the moment they understood no one was coming. That help had never been part of the enemy's plan. That survival, if it happened at all, would be accidental. Those interviews were sealed. Maps were revised quietly. Training manuals were updated subtly. Entire routes were removed from future planning. The valley itself was never used again, not because it was dangerous, but because everyone who studied it understood one terrifying lesson. A trap that kills thousands doesn't need to be sprung often. Once is enough to change how war is feared. And somewhere, far from that silent corridor of stone, other valleys waited. Patient. After the valley was finally secured, commanders searched desperately for something that made sense. A failed maneuver. A missed radio call. A bad decision at the wrong time. Anything, because accepting the truth that 3,000 soldiers had been erased with almost no real fight was unacceptable to every doctrine they believed in. So investigators walked the valley inch by inch, and what they found made things worse. There were no defensive positions among the dead, no fallback lines, no organized counterfire zones. This wasn't because the soldiers lacked courage, it was because the trap had stolen time. From the first shot to total collapse, fewer than 12 minutes had passed. 12 minutes. That was all it took to destroy coordination, leadership, and morale. The opening sniper round killed the officer who knew the route adjustments. The next burst shattered the radio team. Within seconds, command existed only as memory. After that, every man was alone. The valley's shape amplified confusion. Sound ricocheted, making gunfire seem omnipresent and directionless. Men couldn't tell whether shots came from the front, above, or behind. Those who tried to return fire aimed at echoes. They were shooting at stone. The enemy had planned this. Machine guns were mounted lower than expected, firing slightly upward so ricochets fragmented rounds into unpredictable paths. Even cover behind vehicles became lethal as bullets shattered into fragments. One engineer wrote later, "The valley didn't just block movement. It rewired instinct. Men trained to advance froze. Men trained to retreat ran into fire. Men trained to lead died first." The psychological effect was devastating. Fear spread faster than bullets. Once soldiers saw officers fall without warning, authority dissolved. Orders stopped carrying weight. Survival replaced obedience. That was when discipline collapsed. Some men threw down weapons, believing surrender might save them. Others charged blindly, hoping speed could outrun death. Neither worked. The enemy never acknowledged surrender because the trap wasn't built to capture. It was built to empty. Investigators also noticed something else. There were no spent shell casings from heavy weapons on the valley floor. They were all on the ridges. That meant the enemy never moved their guns once firing began. No repositioning. No improvisation. Everything had been decided in advance. Even casualty flow. Fire patterns shifted at exact intervals. 5 minutes of sustained suppression, then pauses just long enough to let men believe it might be over. When movement resumed, the guns answered immediately. Hope was used as bait. One survivor said later, "Every time it went quiet, someone tried to move. And every time someone moved, someone died." The trap didn't just kill bodies, it trained the survivors to betray each other unintentionally. Those who tried to help the wounded exposed themselves. Those who cried out revealed positions. Those who ran caused others to follow, straight into crossfire. The enemy didn't need to hunt. They let instinct do the work. By the time night came, fighting back felt pointless. Not because ammunition was gone, but because belief was gone. Belief that action mattered. Belief that bravery would be rewarded. Belief that war still followed rules. And that realization did something worse than panic. It emptied men from the inside. Later studies would quietly incorporate lessons from that valley, without ever naming it. Training shifted toward dispersion. Columns broke into smaller units. Routes avoided narrow terrain unless absolutely necessary. But the most important change was psychological. Soldiers were taught that silence was not safety. That calm could be manufactured. That the absence of resistance often meant preparation, not retreat. Because in that valley, the enemy never fought back. They simply waited. And waiting, it turned out, could be deadlier than any weapon ever fired. The valley was sealed within 48 hours. Not guarded. Not fortified. Erased. Maps were redrawn. Grid references quietly altered. Patrol routes redirected miles away from the corridor where 3,000 men had vanished. Official briefings stopped mentioning the engagement entirely. What couldn't be hidden was diluted. Severe losses during enemy contact. Operational misjudgment. Lessons learned. No numbers were spoken aloud. Because numbers invite questions, and questions invite blame. Officers who survived the planning phase were reassigned, not punished, promoted sideways into desks far from the front. Staff meetings avoided the topic. Reports that described the trap too clearly were stamped, restricted, and buried in archives no one was expected to open. The 3 survivors were the real problem. Each man carried the same memories, but command feared something else, the certainty in their voices. They didn't speculate. They didn't exaggerate. They described mechanics, angles of fire, timing patterns. Enemy discipline. They spoke like men who had watched a machine work perfectly, so the interviews were compartmentalized. Each man was questioned alone, compared quietly, then silenced politely, not threatened, not imprisoned, just redirected. One was sent home with an injury classification that ended his service. Another was reassigned to a logistics unit where no one asked questions. The third was transferred overseas again, somewhere far quieter, where his story couldn't spread. None of them were forbidden to talk. They were simply never invited to. The valley itself became something else. Scavengers arrived first, locals desperate enough to risk unexploded ordnance. They found weapons still loaded, gear untouched, bodies already unrecognizable under sun and insects. Then engineers came, not to recover, to destroy. Explosives were placed inside the carved firing galleries. The ridges were collapsed inward, burying the very positions that had made the trap perfect. Rockslides erased firing lanes. Cave-ins sealed ammunition rooms forever. From above, it looked like a natural landslide. From the ground, it felt intentional, because it was. They weren't afraid of the enemy returning. They were afraid of proof. Years later, historians would wonder why no monument marked the site, why no memorial existed, why no official casualty list matched rumors whispered among veterans. The answer was simple. The valley didn't fit the story war liked to tell. There were no last stands, no breakthroughs, no glorious sacrifice that changed the course of history. Just preparation defeating bravery. And that lesson was dangerous, because if armies admitted that discipline, patience, and terrain could erase thousands without resistance, then every narrow road, every quiet pass, every empty stretch of land became suspect. War would become slower, more fearful, harder to sell. So instead, the valley became a ghost, spoken about only in fragments. A cautionary tale shared quietly between officers who trusted each other. A training scenario stripped of context and renamed. But among those who knew, truly knew, it became something else. A warning that the most lethal battles aren't fought loudly. They aren't remembered proudly. They are buried carefully. And sometimes, the only thing left of them is a number that never appears on paper. 3,000 in, 3 out, and a silence so complete that even history hesitated to enter it. Long after the valley was buried under paperwork and stone, its influence quietly spread. Not through medals, not through speeches, through fear. Military academies began teaching terrain analysis differently. Valleys were no longer described as natural routes. They were described as decision points, places where an army either controlled the heights or accepted death as a possibility. New doctrines avoided mass movement through confined terrain. Columns were broken apart. Advanced scouts were doubled, then tripled. Silence in enemy territory stopped being reassuring. Silence became a warning. Somewhere in a training manual, its language deliberately vague, a single line appeared. Absence of resistance may indicate preparation. That sentence came directly from the valley, though its name was never written. Veterans carried it longer. Those who had not been there still felt its shadow. Survivors of later campaigns spoke of moments when they refused orders to move through narrow ground, when they demanded air cover or alternate routes without being able to explain why. They just felt it, and sometimes that hesitation saved lives. The 3 survivors never met again, but each carried the same burden. They weren't haunted by gunfire. They weren't haunted by screams. They were haunted by how efficient it had all been. One of them, years later, sat with a historian who gently asked whether he believed anything could have changed the outcome. The man didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "If we'd known earlier that we were already dead, maybe we would have stopped calling it a fight." That statement never made it into the interview transcript, because it challenged everything war depended on. The valley taught a truth too uncomfortable to preserve openly. That courage without control is noise. That numbers without awareness are liability. That the deadliest weapon isn't firepower, it's certainty. The enemy had been certain. Certain of timing. Certain of terrain. Certain of outcome. And certainty doesn't need to rush. It waits. By the time the war ended, countless battles had been fought louder, larger, and bloodier. Cities burned. Armies clashed. Nations collapsed. But none of them erased 3,000 men so completely in a single place without ever becoming famous for it. Because fame requires witnesses, and the valley was designed to leave none. Only stone. Only silence. Only a lesson that still lurks wherever armies march confidently into narrow ground. Believing the quiet means safety. Some traps don't close loudly. They don't snap. They don't explode. They simply exist, patient, measured, and ready, until enough people step inside to make resistance irrelevant. That is why the deadliest trap of World War II was never the one most people remember, and why its shadow still stretches far beyond that forgotten valley. The war didn't learn the lesson all at once. That was the most dangerous part. Within a year, a different front, different country, different uniforms, fell into a valley that looked harmless on paper. The names were different. The terrain description sounded safer. Command believed this time would be different. It wasn't, because the lesson of the first valley hadn't been officially acknowledged, only quietly absorbed. And quiet lessons spread slowly. The enemy had learned too. They had seen what worked. They had seen that destroying morale mattered more than destroying equipment. That killing leaders first was more effective than killing the most men. That terrain, when weaponized, could outperform artillery, so they repeated it, with variations. Sometimes it was a mountain pass. Sometimes a forest road. Sometimes a frozen ravine where sound carried for miles. Each time, the pattern was familiar. Withdrawal signals, false silence, predictable movement routes, then fire from above. What changed was the psychology. Survivors of later traps didn't just report fear. They reported recognition, the moment they realized they were inside something that had been built in advance. One soldier described it like this: you feel it before the shooting starts. Like walking into a room where someone already decided how you'll die. That feeling spread faster than orders ever could. Units stalled. Columns hesitated. Commanders argued. Some advanced anyway, bound by schedules, pride, or pressure from higher command. And every time they did, the cost was measured not just in bodies but in confidence. By mid-war, entire divisions began refusing routes that looked too perfect. Engineers were sent ahead to destroy valleys rather than use them. Artillery softened empty terrain just to provoke a response. Sometimes nothing happened, and that terrified them more, because silence had become suspicious. The original valley was no longer unique. It had become a template. But there was one difference. The more often the trap was used, the more it required perfection. One mistake, one premature shot, one exposed position, and the illusion shattered. That pressure fell on the men setting the trap now. Waiting became harder. Patience became dangerous. And occasionally, the trap failed. Those failures were violent. Brutal. Personal. Traps once hidden turned into slaughter grounds for the ambushers instead. But the first valley, the one that erased 3,000 men, remained flawless, which is why it haunted planners more than all the others combined. Because it proved something terrifying. Perfection was possible. And if it happened once, it could happen again, anywhere. All it took was confidence, silence, and time. And time, in war, is always willing to wait. For years, attention stayed fixed on the dead. On the 3,000 who entered the valley and never left. Almost no one asked the other question: who built it? Not the soldiers who pulled the triggers, not the gunners who followed orders. The planners, the ones who looked at stone and saw geometry, who looked at time and saw leverage, who understood that fear could be engineered as precisely as steel. They were not famous commanders. They didn't write manifestos or give speeches. Most of their names never appeared in newspapers. They were engineers, surveyors, junior officers, men who understood terrain better than tactics. One of them left behind a notebook, recovered years later in an archive that had been mislabeled. Inside were sketches of valleys, passes, river bends. No unit names, no dates, just angles, lines intersecting at precise distances, arcs showing machine gun overlap, notes written in tight handwriting. Silence must last long enough to invite density. Fire should never be constant. Fear needs rhythm. Hope is a tool. Used sparingly. This wasn't cruelty. It was design. They believed war should be efficient. Clean in execution, if not in result. Less chaos meant fewer variables. Fewer variables meant predictable outcomes. In their minds, the valley wasn't a massacre. It was a solution. They had studied older wars, ambushes from centuries past, ancient choke points where armies vanished without understanding why. They combined that old knowledge with modern firepower and discipline. The result wasn't louder, it was quieter. And silence, they discovered, traveled further than gunfire. Some of these men would later be interrogated after the war. Not for that valley specifically, no one could prove enough, but for broader operational patterns. They didn't deny their involvement, they simply spoke clinically. One said, "If you allow them to fight, you give them dignity. If you deny them the chance, you save time." Another added, "A trapped army does not think strategically. It thinks individually. Individual thinking is easy to defeat." There was no anger in their voices, just certainty. That certainty frightened the interrogators more than confession ever could, because it meant the trap wasn't born from desperation. It was born from confidence. After the war, doctrines changed again. Terrain specialists gained more authority. Engineers were promoted into planning roles. Entire units were trained to identify potential kill zones before ever stepping into them. But the damage was done. The idea existed, and ideas survive wars. Somewhere, long after uniforms changed and flags fell, similar valleys would be studied by people who never fought in World War II, but who understood its lessons perfectly. The deadliest traps don't require innovation, only memory. And the men who built the silence ensured that memory would last far longer than any monument ever could. The three survivors were never introduced to one another. That wasn't an accident. They were evacuated on different days, through different routes, to different medical units. Their injuries were documented carefully, their statements recorded selectively, their names filed under classifications that discouraged curiosity. Command understood something simple. If those 3 men ever sat in the same room, the story would become solid, indisputable. So they were kept apart. Individually, each man was treated as an anomaly. Shock. Confusion. Trauma-induced exaggeration. A survivor filling gaps with fear. But together, they were proof. Each survivor carried a different piece of the valley. One remembered the sound, the way machine gun fire echoed so strangely that it felt like the valley itself was shooting. Another remembered the timing, how the guns paused just long enough to make men lift their heads before killing them. The third remembered the worst part, the waiting, pinned under bodies for nearly a full day. He learned the difference between silence and safety. He learned that silence could be active, intentional, watching. He said later, when it finally went quiet, I didn't feel relief. I felt like the valley was holding its breath. After the war, their lives unfolded in ordinary ways that felt foreign to them. One married and never spoke about combat again, not to his wife, not to his children. He refused to enter narrow streets or tunnels. He avoided hills without knowing why. Another drank, not heavily, but consistently. Enough to keep dreams blurred. He worked jobs that let him stay outdoors, where sky felt wide and open. The third tried to tell the story. Once, at a veterans gathering, someone asked him what the worst day of the war had been. He started talking about the valley, about how no one ever had a chance. The room went quiet. Then someone changed the subject. After that, he stopped, because he realized something painful. People wanted stories where suffering had meaning. The valley had none. No victory, no reversal, no turning point. Just loss so complete that it embarrassed history. Years later, when fragments of the event surfaced in declassified documents, historians argued over numbers, over whether it really could have been 3,000 versus 3. Some called it exaggerated, others called it propaganda. The survivors didn't argue. They didn't correct anyone, because arguing meant revisiting a place their minds had spent decades trying to escape. And deep down, they knew something else. If the world accepted the valley as real, then it would have to accept how fragile order really was, how easily planning could overpower courage. It was easier to doubt. The valley remained unmarked. Its stones weathered, its paths filled slowly with grass. But sometimes, hikers reported an unsettling feeling when passing through. No sound, no birds, no wind, just the sense of standing somewhere that had learned too much about men. And the 3 who walked out carried that knowledge until they died. Never heroes, never celebrated, but forever certain of one thing. The deadliest trap of World War II didn't need secrecy to work. Only the willingness of history to look away. When the war finally ended, it did so loudly. Cities burned, flags fell, documents were signed in rooms filled with cameras and witnesses. History closed the chapter with dates, treaties, and victory parades. The valley was not mentioned. It didn't fit the ending. Wars like conclusions that feel earned. They like arcs. Sacrifice leading to triumph, loss balanced by meaning. The valley offered none of that. It was an interruption, a reminder that progress and planning could be erased by preparation and patience. So it remained unfinished in the official story. But among soldiers who lived long enough to study the war afterward, the valley became a quiet reference point. Not spoken of directly but implied. A narrow pass marked in red pencil. A route avoided without explanation. A briefing that lingered a little too long on elevation lines. And when new wars came, as they always do, the lesson followed. Different uniforms, different weapons. Same mistake. Confidence entering silence. In later conflicts, commanders would sometimes stop in advance without being able to justify it clearly. Something felt wrong. The terrain was too cooperative. The enemy too absent. Those pauses saved lives. No one ever thanked the valley. No one ever said its name. But it shaped decisions far beyond its stone walls. The enemy planners who had designed the trap mostly disappeared into obscurity. Some died in the war. Others lived quietly afterward, their ideas absorbed into doctrines without credit or blame. Their creation had outlived them, because the deadliest traps don't need to be rebuilt. They only need to be remembered. And that is the most unsettling legacy of all. That 3,000 men didn't die to teach a lesson intentionally, yet their absence taught one anyway. That silence can be engineered. That terrain can think. That numbers mean nothing once movement is denied. And that war, at its most efficient, does not rage. It waits. That is why the deadliest trap of World War II was never marked by fire or fame. It was marked by how easily it was forgotten, and by how often it almost happened again. Wars are remembered for their noise, for explosions, charges, last stands. But the deadliest moments often make no sound at all. 3,000 men didn't fall because they were weaker. They didn't die because they lacked courage. They vanished because someone understood silence better than they did. The valley didn't attack them. It accepted them, and once they were inside, the outcome was already decided. That is the danger history rarely warns us about. Not the enemy you can see, but the absence that waits calmly, confidently, knowing time is on its side. If this story feels unsettling, it should. Because the most effective weapons of war are still patience, planning, and terrain, and they never went away. This is Dark War Records.